Om Sthapakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharma svarupini avatara varishtaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our ongoing class on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. In our last class, class 2, we discussed Sutras 1 and 2 of the first book. So we just started, basically, along with Edwin Bryant's commentary in this book, the Yoga Sutras of Patañjali. So today, we're tackling Sutras 3 through 5 of Book 1 of the Yoga Sutras, along with Bryant's commentary. So our homework assignment was to read Bryant's commentary on 1.3 to 1.5, which is pages 22 to 31 of Bryant's book. And a heads up for our next class. Our next class will be held on Thursday, June 6th at 7:30 p.m. PST. And the assignment is to study carefully Yoga Sutra 1.6 to 1.8, those three sutras, along with Bryant's commentary, which is found on pages 32 to 39 of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, Bryant's book, Edwin Bryant's book. Okay, so as usual, an added challenge for those of you who are up to it. So far I haven't found any takers, unfortunately. Maybe Narayana. Anyway, an added challenge is to try to memorize along with me the sutras as we go through them. So today we've read up to Sutra 5, which means we are going to recite, ideally from memory, Sutras 1.1 to 1.5. At least I will, I'll try to. And after I repeat each one, you please repeat. And you can follow along. You don't have to, if you haven't memorized it, just read out from the book that you're following. But do you guys have it open to whatever, the Sanskrit of these 1.1 to 5? Because I'm going to start reciting and I want you to repeat, okay? All right. Atha yoga anushasanam. Let's try that again. Atha yoga anushasanam. Good. Yogash chitta vritti nirodhaha. Tada drashtuhu swarupeva sthanam vrittisarupyam itaratra vrittisarupyam itaratra vrittayaha panchatayyaha klishta. Good. That's 1 through 5. Okay, this is a bit tough for some of you. Anyway, keep working on it. With more practice, you'll get better at it. Okay? So, let's start with 1.3. Tada drashtuhu swarupeva sthanam. Now, the context is really important because there's a logical sequence. So 1.3 follows directly from body-mind complex, completely unaffected by anything in this world, including our own body-mind complexes. So at that time, at what time? Any guesses? When, yeah, well, that's right. When what is accomplished? Well, that's right. The chitta vritti. So it's referring back to 1.2. Yoga is defined as the nirodha, the restraint of all mental modifications, all vrittis. So 1.3 says, when that happens, when those all mental fluctuations are stopped, then what? Drashtuhu, the seer, the purusha, svarupe avasthanam. Avasthanam means the 1.2, just as 1.2. It never suffers from delusion. It never suffers from confusion. It's not capable of making any kind of mistakes. This is just the nature of Purusha, according to Sankhya philosophy, on which Patanjali's system is based. Purusha is eternally pure, is never bound in this world. You'll find it in the foundational scriptures of Sankhya, the Sankhya Karika, and other places. If that's true, how can it be possible that it's only when the chitta vrittis are restrained that the Purusha rests in its true nature? The Purusha is always resting in its true nature. That's the fact. This is Vyasa himself, who's the first and most important commentator on the Yoga Sutras. He's the one to make this point. He says it as follows. Bryant mentions this. Vyasa says, what this really means, how should we take the tada here, this at that time? He says, the self does not appear to be established in its own nature, even though it is, even when the mind is distracted. Let me read this again. This is how he says we should interpret 1.3. The self, the Purusha, the seer, does not appear to be established in its own nature, even though it is established in its own nature, even when the mind is not in that perfect state of chitta vritti nirodha, even when there are mental fluctuations, vrittis going on all the time. Do you see? Okay, but now there's another issue. This introduces the problem, another problem that I introduced several classes ago, which keeps coming up, and it's going to come up again. It's going to be one of the main themes of today's class as well. Who exactly is bound and liberated in yoga philosophy, according to Sankhya and yoga philosophy? Who exactly is it? We are. That's a good answer. It's both good and unsatisfying at the same time. Yeah. Yes. Well, that's the thing. So, okay. One answer is Purusha, but the Purusha is by definition ever free. That doesn't fit the bill of being bound, right? And on the other hand, Buddhi, which is one of the standard answers, Buddhi meaning the intellect, the discriminatory intellect, falls on the side of Prakriti, nature, which is by definition insentient, so totally lacking in consciousness. How can something that's as insentient as a stone be bound or liberated? It needs to at least be a conscious entity that's bound and liberated, right? So this is a very tricky philosophical problem in Sankhya. And all of these commentators are kind of circling around this issue and giving, I think, they kind of give different answers at different times, depending on what the sutra is saying. So in this case, it's very interesting. Vyasa, I'll repeat it one more time, because it's a very interesting sentence, the way he formulates it. The self does not appear to be established in its own nature, even though it is, even when the mind is distracted. So my question is, appear to whom? The self does not appear to be established in its own nature. Who is under the delusion that the self is not established in its own nature? Who are you? Well, no, it's a good answer in a way, but who are you?
Okay, so I'm...
Follow-up question, yes.
Vrittis, and I'm bound by them, and I see myself and other people as being bound. I don't see anybody liberated.
Right, you feel bound, right?
Yeah.
That's good, yeah. I mean, this is very much like along the lines of Shankara's answer when somebody presses him on this question of who exactly has avidya? And he goes, the person who's asking the question. Very clever. So you're pulling a Shankara on me, which is good. I think it's good.
In Vedanta, there's the concept of jiva.
Yeah.
Maybe
Shankara has a problem with it because the jiva is not ultimately real. But correct. Why don't we have a mic so people online can actually hear you guys? Why don't you use it? Okay, so now say the same thing again, except with the mic.
Kind of the saving grace for Vedanta, and Shankara's, maybe he doesn't handle it the best. The saving grace is the jiva, which in other schools of Vedanta is its own real thing
conscious entity
that does really experience liberation.
Bondage and liberation. There's jiva in a state of bondage, and then there's the same jiva in the state of liberation when it gets liberation.
Right.
These are in bhakti schools of Vedanta.
Right.
Advaita Vedanta is complicated because ultimately they don't accept the reality of the jiva, individual souls. So I think that's right. If only Sankhya and Yoga posited the existence of a jiva, a real individual soul, then it wouldn't have this problem. But the problem is, so the moment I ask you, what exactly are you? And if you say, well, I'm an individual soul, I'm a jiva, then I'll ask you, what side do you fall on, the Purusha side or the Prakriti side? And your answer is something like neither or both. Or you're straddling the border between the two. I mean, it gets very confusing. So that's the issue, exactly. Yeah. Mike.
And then
yeah.
if you're straddling the border between the two, aren't you a third thing? Doesn't that mean there's...
Well, that's the point, is that you're not allowed to straddle the border,
Right.
according to Samkhya and Yoga. Straddling the border is strictly prohibited. No border straddling. Because that's blurring the metaphysical lines between Purusha and Prakriti, which it's absolutely fundamental to this metaphysical system of Sankhya and Yoga, that there be no blurring of boundaries and there be no overlap between Purusha and Prakriti. Purusha remains completely untouched by Prakriti all along. It was never, in fact, associated with Prakriti at any time. So even these formulations, I think, raise questions. When Vyasa says the self does not appear to be established in its own nature, to whom? Somebody will say, well, to me. Narayana will say to him, or I'll say to me. But who am I? It gets kind of heady and weird. So, am I the Purusha? If I'm the Purusha, then I'm eternally liberated. So then I don't need to do anything. Because nothing I do as a body-mind is going to affect what I am as Purusha. I'm already liberated. You see? And if I'm just an insentient body-mind complex, right? Both body and mind, physical body and mind, both fall on the side of nature. Then I've got no consciousness. I'm insentient. And then it gets really creepy and very kind of contemporary in a way, because we're talking about shows like Westworld and movies like Ex Machina, if anyone's seen that. Weird stuff, where AI robots start to wonder whether they are conscious or not. And the question is whether that's even coherent, whether that's a coherent possibility. Is it possible for an insentient entity, like an AI robot, just posit an AI robot that looks completely humanoid, lifelike, like one of you could be an AI robot, maybe I am, who knows. In that case, is it possible for an AI robot to question whether it's conscious?
No, not possible.
Yeah, so can you give him the mic? That's my intuition, but let's hear your reasoning.
Okay, well, I just think it's not possible because, I mean, if you look at our life, we start out as a little tiny thing and grow and grow and grow and grow. We don't just all of a sudden become humans, and I don't think robots are all of a sudden going to become humans.
Keep the mic closer to you.
With, it just doesn't seem, like jillions of years, however long that is, of evolution have gone into making humans, and how can a robot just without, its parts aren't alive like a human's are.
Yeah. Okay, that's an interesting, issue, about evolution, and AI robots have not been evolved, they haven't evolved in the way that we have over millions of years. But there's an interesting question about consciousness. Is consciousness that came up, is it something that emerged in the course of evolution? The Indian spiritual answer is no. Consciousness can't possibly emerge from physical processes. Yeah, something cannot come from nothing. And so that it's very hard to explain otherwise how consciousness, to say that at a certain point in the evolutionary process, consciousness somehow magically appeared. That gets tricky. But I think your overall point is right. The way I would put it is, if what seems to be an AI robot is actually doubting whether or not it's conscious, the very fact that it's capable of doubting its own existence means that it is conscious, which means that it's not an AI robot.
But
Did you follow what I just said? Hold on, but let me repeat that. Or did you follow that? You guys are all, okay. Okay, well then go ahead. Well, let's what's your name? Sultan, yeah. We'll get back to Keshav.
I think also something that could be blurry is like, let's say an AI robot is sitting in this lecture and they're hearing us talk about consciousness, awareness, and just the words, they could now ask a question using those words, but they might not know what it means. But I guess it's like, is the fact that they're asking the question and they're like latching onto some type of pattern,
right?
Somehow, because I feel like even with me, like I can pattern match certain things. Like you could like speak in Sanskrit, and I'll start to pattern match certain things. Yeah. And from that pattern matching, I start to figure out the meaning. Yeah. So, I guess like maybe an AI could go from like a
I see what you're saying. They can formulate the question.
Yeah.
But will they feel it from the
Yeah,
first person
exactly,
perspective in the
exactly.
way that we do as
Yeah.
conscious entities?
Yeah.
Like the question would be, am I conscious? That's it. Can an AI robot coherently raise this question? They can say it. They might ask you in a creepy way, the chat GPT, am I conscious? And then, but that doesn't mean that it's actually wondering whether it's conscious. I don't think so. But anyway, I mean, I think intelligent people can disagree about this. Yeah, we might, when somebody does that, follows this pattern, an AI robot follows a pattern, and even shows the external emotions and gestures, facial gestures and hand gestures of somebody who actually is, like in Ex Machina, this guy who's like actually cutting himself to see whether he's feeling pain, then he might fool us into thinking that that person is actually in anguish, wondering whether he or she is conscious, But all along, it's not. Those are just external signs. It's a kind of mimicry of an actual conscious being. So anyway, coming back to this issue, there's a devotee in Netherlands named Vasu who raised this question based on the previous couple classes where I raised this problem of who exactly is bound and liberated. And he takes Bryant's side on the issue. Bryant's position seems to be generally that it's buddhi. Buddhi illuminated by the consciousness of Purusha, which thinks it's bound and which eventually gets liberated. And what he says is, what's wrong with that as an answer? Because it is just it's one of the faculties of buddhi to misidentify, to make a mistaken identification, mistakenly identifying the Purusha with chittavrittis. That's just one of the functions of the mind. And it doesn't need to be sentient for it to perform that function. It's like computers which can think without being conscious. Do you see what I mean? So that's his question. Yeah, do you have an answer to that question, or should we? Can you give the mic to?
I mean, doesn't that seem to suggest the whole idea of superimposition of because I then illuminated buddhi out of Purusha consciousness, then that would be something that would not arise out of matter at all. So they just continued the whole idea of insentience in the actual physical body, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem with Vasu's answer, which is that he's saying it's the buddhi, which is insentient, but sort of illuminated by the consciousness of Purusha, which misidentifies. The problem is that buddhi, in essence, is not Purusha. You can't say that the buddhi in its true nature is Purusha, because it's not. It's as dead and as insentient as a stone, you see. And so that also can't be the right candidate for what's the entity that's bound or liberated, right? Because stones can't be bound or liberated. And then to use the metaphor of, it's the buddhi illuminated by consciousness. But what does illuminated by consciousness mean? We can't push it too far because Purusha can never actually make contact in any way with Prakriti. And they can never actually be conjoined. Yeah.
So if like Purusha and Prakriti can never like make contact whatsoever, then like why do we like appear to be like why do we say that we're like in this body or like we're bound by this body?
I think it comes back to something that Keshav was saying, which is that I think like we sort of need to posit the existence of a jiva, an individual soul, which is some kind of admixture, or at least temporary admixture of Purusha and Prakriti, the consciousness of Purusha with the body-mind complex of Prakriti. Now, there's another weird consequence of this, if we accept that view. Actually, some Sankhyans actually do. Hariharananda Āraṇya, I mentioned in a previous class, his view is that it's the jiva that's bound and liberated. It's kind of like Narayana's answer. But if you push that far enough within the framework of Sankhya and yoga philosophy, I think you're committed to the following. Just imagine, I'm a patient who goes to a doctor complaining about a headache, and I ask the doctor, please cure me of my headache. And the doctor says, no problem. Takes a sledgehammer, bashes me over the head with it. Doesn't he cure my headache? He does, right? But he kills me in the process. But I actually think that's the logical consequence of this view, which is that the bound jiva, when the bound jiva attains liberation for that jiva consists in its extinction. I was going to say it realizes it never existed, but you can't realize that you never existed. So it just disappears, it vanishes like it never was. And there was just Purusha all along.
I was going to say that sounds kind of like the Buddhist idea that the flame is just kind of, it gets extinguished. And it's like if the Purusha is illuminating the Buddhi, then, but there's a good question here that's kind of a side point, that how do you use the Buddhi in order to realize Purusha if one of the primary characteristics of the Buddhi is misidentification?
Well, that's one of them, but it can also disidentify. It can break that it can overcome that misidentification. So the Buddhi is capable of both, but the question still remains about what exactly is bound and liberated. Yeah.
So is it really an issue of misidentification, or a functional structure between the two, between Purusha and Prakriti, in which it's able to be a bridge? And kind of
what is the bridge here?
Well, the bridge would be Buddhi, right?
Well, Buddhi is not, well, it can't be by definition because it falls on the side of nature.
But then it does end up having to be a superimposition by misidentification in the end, because it actually has to be placed on insentient matter to be able to be a functional
Buddhi is insentient matter.
Okay.
Buddhi is insentient matter. It's on the side of insentient nature. And
I keep feeling like it needs to be pulled in between the two as it's being both bound and liberated.
Well, yeah, that is the problem that I keep saying. Yeah, exactly, is that either the Purusha needs to be pulled on the side of Prakriti, or Prakriti needs to be pulled a little bit on the side of Purusha. But it's hard to see how they can be completely separate and for this to get off the ground. So Vachaspati Mishra, another one of the major commentators on the Yoga Sutras, he uses a metaphor which Bryant talks about. He says, imagine that there's a crystal, and he likens that crystal to a Purusha. And he says, now imagine that you take a hibiscus, a beautiful red hibiscus flower, place it next to the crystal. What does the crystal look like then? The crystal looks red. It's the reflected redness of the flower now appearing in the crystal. In fact, the crystal doesn't turn red at all. It only appears to be red. But again, the same question can be asked. To whom? To whom does this crystal appear to be red? To the crystal itself? No, the crystal is never diluted. It can't be, because by definition the Purusha is never diluted. And Buddhi is insentient, so that it can't appear to this insentient intellect to be a red crystal, if it's as insentient as a stone. So I think that even the metaphor still raises the same problem. Okay, so that's one thing I wanted to flag. And now we can... So the key takeaway here, though, is the really important point is tada. That word tada in 1.3, which means at that time, it can't be taken literally, okay? Because it's not like at other times, Purusha is not resting in its true nature, right? So Purusha always rests in its true nature, but some conscious entity, that person who is bound and liberated, mistakenly thinks that the Purusha is identified with these chitta vrittis, these mental fluctuations, and as a result feels that it's suffering. Okay? This is the basic idea. So now, let's move on to 1.4. Vritti sarupyam itaratra. Okay, it's a short sutra, but again, pregnant with meaning. Remember, in 1.3 was tada, which means at that time. Itaratra in 1.4 means at other times. So the two things are kind of opposites. At that time in 1.3, at the time when there is chitta vritti nirodha, right, then the Purusha rests in its true nature. At other times, says 1.4, vritti sarupyam. The Purusha seems to be one with these chitta vrittis. The Purusha it gets mixed up with, or seems to be identified with the chitta vrittis. Now, Edwin Bryant's translation of this is a little unusual, I would say. I don't want to say that's wrong, but it's unusual. It's not typically translated in this way. He says, otherwise, at other times, so the itaratra. So when there's not chitta vritti nirodha, then what? The seer is absorbed in the changing states of the mind. So he's rendering vritti sarupyam as the Purusha being absorbed in the chitta vrittis. This is kind of interesting because, again, the Purusha being absorbed in the chitta vrittis seems to imply that it's the Purusha who's bound. Right? He's making the mistake of getting caught up in the chitta vrittis, and then its liberation is to realize, I guess, that it was never absorbed in the first place, right? That would be the... But that's not really consistent with his own understanding of who's bound and liberated, because he says that it's buddhi that who's bound and liberated. Maybe I'm missing something, and that there's a very easy solution to this whole problem, which I'm missing, but yeah, go ahead. Purusha. Seer always means Purusha. Yeah.
Does Kashmiri Shaivism have a similar problem where it's Shiva playing and Shiva forgets that he's Shiva?
It could. It depends on how you interpret the philosophy. But both Kashmiri Shaivism and my understanding of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy as Vijnana Vedanta, they're non-dual philosophies in the sense that they accept that there's only one reality, which is in Kashmiri Shaivism, Shiva Shakti, in Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy, Brahma Shakti. At the same time, both these non-dual philosophies accept the reality of individual souls, of jivas. So then the philosophical question is a little bit different. The philosophical difficulty or challenge is to explain how a single divine consciousness can individuate into multiple individual consciousnesses, each with his or her own perspective. And I've written an entire article on this if you're interested. It's got a very long-winded academic title, The Playful Self-Involution of Divine Consciousness, Sri Aurobindo's Evolutionary Cosmopsychism, and his solution to the individuation problem, published by The Monist a couple years ago. So you check it out. It sounds exciting, right? So in that article, I actually explain in technical detail how Sri Aurobindo, who's I place him in the same spiritual lineage and philosophical lineage as Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, how he explains how a single non-dual divine consciousness can individuate coherently into multiple individual consciousnesses. And he uses the idea of self-limitation, that if the divine consciousness is really omnipotent and divine, then it should be able to limit itself in a spirit of play. And in doing so, it can actually limit itself in the form of multiple individual consciousness. And then he goes into really, as I said, technical detail, which I talk about in the article. So that's the short answer. So that's a good question. But in any case, let's not get too far afield from, because that's a very different metaphysical framework from the one we're talking about, which is Sankhya and Yoga. They don't posit a divine consciousness in that way. They're not non-dual philosophies at all, Sankhya and Yoga. They're very much dualistic philosophies. There's Purusha on the one hand, multiple Purushas. Each of you has a different Purusha. Eternal souls separate from nature. And then on the other side, we have everything else, which is all insentient nature. Okay? So, the term itaratra, just like tada in 1.3 at that time, this itaratra at other times cannot be taken literally. Should not be. Right? Because again, the Purusha is always resting in its true nature. It's never actually absorbed in the chitta vrittis. It only appears to be absorbed. Appears to whom? Again, the same question. Which, I mean, I do have email exchanges with Edwin Bryant sometimes, but I haven't brought up these issues with him. He's been very kind in responding in general. So the reason why I would question his translation here is because Purusha seeming to be absorbed in chitta vrittis seems to be implying that it's the Purusha who's mistakenly identifying with the vrittis. And that can only be possible if there's a jiva. I mean, I think, like, again and again, he seems to be circling around the idea that there is this conscious individual soul, which is in its true nature Purusha, but which mistakenly thinks it's the body-mind complex. That's pure Vedanta, in a sense. That's coherent. But since Sankhya and Yoga can't posit a jiva, a conscious individual soul which nonetheless feels bound, we have serious problems in justifying that. So there are other translations. So if you look at other translations of the Yoga Sutras, you'll find a more literal translation would be something like, the Purusha assumes the form of vrittis. And that's more literal, actually. Sarupyam. Rupa means form. So sarupyam means taking the form of. So at other times, Purusha assumes the form of vrittis. And again, you have to add this qualifying phrase, appears to. The Purusha appears to assume the form of mental fluctuations. Again, appears to whom? And then you get the same problem. And I thought we could do a little bit of close reading of his commentary here because it's quite interesting. Let's read the first paragraph of his commentary on 1.4, page 24. Patanjali states here that at other times, itaratra, that is, when not abiding in its own nature as pure consciousness devoid of content, the seer is absorbed, sarupyam, in the vrittis, the mind's changing states. Vyasa calls the soul the master and the mind its property, and so on. Okay. Then he says, I'll skip a little bit. When these ever-changing states of mind, meaning these chitta vrittis, are presented to the soul becomes conscious of them, but is mistakenly identified with them by the chitta, and thereby appears affected by them. So notice the language here. It's in the passive tense. Who's doing the mistaken identification? He says it clearly here. Chitta, the mind, the buddhi. That's Bryant's standard answer, as I said. The mind is mistakenly identifying the chitta vrittis with the Purusha. The problem, as I said, this is Vasu's answer, that Netherlands person, who's the student who's following the class. The problem, as I said, is, but ultimately, that buddhi, that chitta, is insentient. And so it can, even as an AI robot, can misidentify or identify things or give right answers or give wrong answers and make mistakes, right? Play chess, win chess matches, lose chess matches, do all that stuff. But it can never be conscious. It can never consciously be in a state of bondage. Bondage means it has to be a conscious entity that's bound, right? So I still think that there's a problem here. Look, the Purusha has nothing to do with the chitta at the end of the day. The Purusha is not actually the true nature of the chitta at all. You see, it would be the true nature of the jiva if we believed in a jiva, but we're not allowed to. So again, the same problem. Yeah, did you have your hand up, Leela?
I kind of did, because
Okay.
I was thinking it was kind of
Please
a
give her the
brilliant
mic.
idea.
Give her the mic, and then we can.
I was thinking it was kind of a brilliant idea that Vyasa was saying that if the soul as the master and the mind being its own property, which would therefore be that tied to the insentient matter. But I'm now a little confused again because we're back to the idea that the jiva can't be posited as an idea.
Yeah, I know. So all these metaphors seem to suggest that there's some connection between Purusha and Prakriti, which is not actually there. So even this master-servant analogy has the same issue. Let's keep reading because it gets more confusing as he continues his commentary. Next sentence. This misidentification, which is supposed to be misidentification by chitta, right? Remember. Or ignorance, avidya, is the cause of the soul's apparent bondage in the physical world of matter. What's going on? Now it's the soul's apparent bondage. The soul is Purusha. The soul's apparent bondage, so it's not actually bound. But apparent to whom? And again, I guess Bryant's answer would be to chitta. But the chitta is not a conscious entity, so it can't appear to chitta to be anything. Who is it appearing
It
to?
appeared to the Purusha.
But then the Purusha is bound. So the
bound.
Purusha is making a cognitive error then, which is by definition out of bounds. That's the thing. Even if the Purusha was somehow Sakshi all along, but somehow mistook itself with the body-mind complex, that would be fine. But that's just, by definition, that's ruled out. Purusha never makes any mistakes. It always rests in its true nature and always knows that it's resting in its true nature. That's just by definition what the Purusha is. Okay. And let me read on, just to add to the confusion. Vachaspati Mishra, so one of these great traditional commentators, repeats the analogy of someone looking in a dirty mirror. Notice this analogy. Identifying with the dirty reflection, and then becoming anxious, thinking he or she is dirty. Likewise, when one is not aware of the distinction between consciousness and the mind, one wrongly attributes the states of the mind to the self. The cause of the person's anxiety, frustrations, and experiences is misidentification with something that he or she is not.
But then that would be the Purusha that, right? If,
Or
like,
jiva, yeah.
Right, or the Purusha or the
either
Jiva
the conscious
that looks in
Purusha.
the dirty mirror and thinks it's dirty.
Exactly. I think the
And
dirty
then it's
mirror analogy
confused.
again strongly implies that it's a Purusha who at least thinks that he or she is bound. It's not he or she, it is bound, let's say. But Purusha is not allowed to ever make that mistake. It can never confuse itself for something it's not. So it can't really be the Purusha. So again, even that last sentence, the cause of the person's anxiety. So again, we come back to Narayana's answer, which is me. I'm the one who feels bound. But who is the me here? Who is the I? And I think again and again, we're forced to posit a kind of straddling entity at the border of Purusha and Prakriti, namely the Jiva, but which doesn't fit easily into the Purusha-Prakriti dichotomy within the Sankhya metaphysical framework. Yeah.
So, but isn't Edward Bryant here playing ball by the game that it is and saying that it's chitta? And so he might be aware that this is a problem, but he's trying to play straight with Sankhya and
Oh, that's an interesting point.
that's because
Right.
in the footnotes he does say he sees lots of problems with this point of view.
I think that's good. I think that's a generous way of looking at it, and I think there's some truth to that, which is that Bryant does acknowledge at other places, in the introduction and especially toward the end of the book, in the appendix, that this is a serious philosophical problem. I think he's still a little too quick to assume that the problem is more or less solved if you take citta to be the entity that is bound and liberated. Like I feel like he doesn't fully recognize the depth of the problem and how far-reaching the implications of the problem are. But I think you're right that his own kind of what seems to be a vacillation between sometimes suggesting that it's citta or buddhi that's bound and liberated and sometimes suggesting it's more purusha actually tracks a similar ambiguity in the traditional commentaries. In Vyasa, in Vachaspati Mishra, and in others. And to some extent, he's just faithfully tracking those ambiguities. But as a contemporary reader and as a philosophical and critical thinker, one can still express their frustration with these ambiguities and vacillations. Yeah, so I think that's right. I also wanted to share with you on page 26, Bryant suggests his own analogy. So he's a commentator in his own right, and so he's allowed to do that. And so he gives his own commentary using a modern piece of technology. So let's look at that. This is starting in about the middle of page 26. He says, in the same vein, a more modern analogy comes to mind for the process by which Prakriti is conjoined with Purusha. He can't really mean conjoined. He doesn't really mean that. I'm not going to, So is apparently conjoined. Let's just add the word apparently. But still, let's see whether his own analogy, modern analogy, helps to clarify the situation. He says, consider a group of people watching a film. Imagine this is a movie theater. We're all watching a film. How about the back of the board here? Okay. The film itself consists of just a sequence of inert, flickering images and sounds, which are nothing more than light particles and frequency waves, material energy. The people watching the film, however, can become so absorbed in this spectacle of light and sound that they forgot their own existence. If the film is a good one, 2 or 3 hours can pass during which the viewers forget about their real lives and personal issues they are undergoing, such as mental anxieties or fears or bodily needs or aches and pains. Moreover, the viewers can become so wrapped up in the illusory world of the film that they experience, let us suppose, sadness when the hero or heroine is killed, or happiness when hero or heroine live happily ever after. In other words, the viewers forget their own separate existences and experience emotions produced by intense identification with the illusory and separate world of the film, and so on and so forth. Okay. In the same way, due to the mind's ignorance and illusion, the soul appears absorbed in the lights and sounds and emotions of the external objective world, and forgetful of its own real nature. Forgetful of its own real nature. This is interesting. As pure consciousness, even though it is merely the witness of all these, which are actually taking place in the mind's vrittis. Yoga is about stilling the vrittis, stopping the film midway, so that the mind can realize that the emotions, fears, happiness, pains, births and deaths, etc., it has been experiencing, do not exist in the soul, but are the inert flickerings and permutations of the material spectacle. So my question to you is, How does this film analogy succeed in clarifying the question of who is bound and liberated in Sankhya and yoga philosophy? Does it help at all, or does it confuse matters further?
At first I thought, like, okay, this makes a little bit more sense. But then it's saying that, like, the mind stuff isn't a part of the person, it's a part of the movie.
Yeah, exactly. Who's the audience watching the film? What's that likened to in the analogy? What does that correspond to?
Well, there's the audiences, that's the soul, and then there's
It's Purusha. Hold on, just say that. Hold on. Yeah. It's clearly Purusha, I think. That's why he's using this analogy to explain 1.4, which is, he translates as, otherwise at other times the Purusha is absorbed in the chittavrittis, in the changing states of the mind. Notice the language of absorption. Same language is used in this movie analogy. When the audience is so absorbed in the film that it mistakenly identifies with the characters, the heroine or the heroes in the film itself. Likewise, the Purusha mistakenly, it gets so absorbed in the play of Prakriti, this world, that it mistakenly identifies with the body-mind complex. But now he's toggling on the side of, you're moving to the side of the Purusha is making the mistake of thinking that it's bound, when in fact it never was. So it seems to me that there's always this kind of vacillation and ambiguity, and that some of the metaphors he uses are going in the opposite direction of his official position. And as I said, I don't think it's a problem with Bryant. I think it's a problem it's endemic to the Sankhya Yoga philosophy because of its metaphysical dualism, this very strict bifurcation between Purusha and Prakriti, and not allowing there to be any interaction between these two fundamental realities. Okay. I suggest we move on to 1.5 because we need to discuss that as well. 1.5. Vrittayaha, panchatayaha, klishtaha. Bryant translates this as follows. There are 5 kinds of changing states of the mind, and they are either detrimental or non-detrimental to the practice of yoga, is implied but not stated. Bryant helpfully in his commentary gives us kind of a heads up of the upcoming sutras and how they're related to this one. He says, starting with this sutra, so 1.5 all the way up to 1.12, the next 8 sutras, discuss vrittis, these changing states of the mind. What are they? It classifies the different kinds of vrittis, all these things. That's what 1.5 through 12 is about. Then 1.13 to 16 concerns the nirodha of these vrittis. How do you stop these changing states of the mind? How do you eliminate them? Which is the whole purpose of yoga, sadhana, the yoga, spiritual practice of yoga. Okay, so that's what we're going to be discussing for the next few classes. Okay, so keep in mind the general structure of the next few sutras. This is just the first of 8 sutras which are going to discuss vrittis. And all it's saying is, these vrittis can be classified into 5 broad categories, which are going to be explained in the very next sutra. So we're not going to talk about, don't ask me about what the 5 categories are, that's for next class. But klishtaha is the important word here, which is explained in detail in this commentary. Some vrittis are klishta, others are aklishta. Klishta, I think Bryant very nicely translates as detrimental. These are vrittis which are detrimental, but then the word detrimental in English means detrimental to something, right? So he says detrimental to what? To the practice of yoga. They work at cross purposes with our attempts to make spiritual progress and ultimately realize our true nature as Purushas, separate from the body-mind complex. So now, we're going to start to look at what I wrote on the board here. Okay. Let's look at page 28 of his commentary on 1.5, and it's the first full paragraph, a little below the halfway point of this page. Bryant says, Vyasa states that the detrimental vrittis, meaning the klishta vrittis, are caused by the 5 kleshas. Kleshas are translated as impediments or afflictions. The impediments to the practice of yoga. And now he very helpfully explains what they are. So listen carefully. I didn't write it. It'd be too much to write. But in 2.3, so in the next book of the Yoga Sutra, in the third sutra of the next book, 2.3, Patanjali defines the 5 kleshas as follows. And I'll just give you the English words here. Ignorance, ego, attachment, aversion, and clinging to life. Ignorance, ego, attachment, aversion, and clinging to life. We don't get the definition of the kleshas until 2.3, okay? But you have to bring it in now. That's why it's very useful to kind of read through the entire 4 books of the Yoga Sutras all at once. Not necessarily even with the commentaries or just kind of skimming, just so you get a sense of the whole overall arc, and then you can come back and kind of put things together. That's true of most of these great scriptures, like the Gita. We're finding again and again in the class I'm teaching on Bhagavad Gita and the light of Sri Ramakrishna, that whenever Sri Aurobindo talks about a particular shloka, he's always bringing up, we're on chapter 2, but he's already talking about chapter 7, chapter 15, chapter 18 sometimes. So that's in the nature of things. Okay, so let me keep reading. The term for detrimental, klishta, comes from the same root as klesha. Klish, to trouble or torment. So there's an etymological affinity, connection between the word klishta and aklishta in Sutra 1.5 and klesha, which comes up in 2.3, afflictions or impediments. Do you see? And that's important. So he goes on to explain why. He says, these types of mental states are detrimental to the goals of yoga because they are the fertile soil from which the seeds of karma sprout. The klishta vrittis culminate in bondage. They are essentially the products of rajas and tamas, the 2 lower gunas, rajas and tamas. Aklishta vrittis, okay, so I've explained this. I'll get to this in a second. I mean, we've already more or less covered it, but there's a little bit more to it. The 5 kleshas, ignorance, ego, attachment, aversion, and clinging to life, produce klishta vrittis. These are the bad vrittis, which lead us away from spiritual progress and liberation. Those vrittis result in our karmic bondage. How? Vyasa explains that there is a vicious cycle of vrittis and samskaras. This is another term I'm introducing. This is in Vyasa's commentary. Samskaras means latent mental impressions. Okay, so I have a particular klishta vritti. Let's say I'm an ex-smoker. I used to smoke a lot, let's say, and I suddenly see somebody smoking and I'm tempted, and so this thought arises in my mind, I want to smoke. What happens? Those samskaras that were already in my mind, the latent mental impressions from having smoked in the past, they get reactivated. And they generate a tremendous desire to smoke. And he talks usefully about addiction, the nature of addiction, because he says that actually this whole yoga psychology, if you also accept karma and rebirth, right, as part and parcel, people who are born with certain addictions, Vedanta and yoga will say it's because you had that problem in a previous life, and those samskaras are still there, those latent mental impressions. And anything can trigger it, you see. If I see somebody smoking, that can trigger the latent samskaras which are already there in my mind. And so it becomes this vicious circle where you seem trapped, right? These latent mental impressions get reactivated. That produces more vrittis and a more intense desire too. The thought arises again and again, I have to smoke. And then you end up smoking. Let's imagine you smoking. You smoke, and then what happens? The desire doesn't go away. It produces more samskaras. And as we know, one of the famous verses in the Bhagavata Purana, a great Vedantic scripture, is Na jatu kamaha kamanam upavogena shamyati havisha krishnavatmeva bhuye eva vivardate. Desire is never satisfied through enjoyment. Right? I think that if I smoke that cigarette, then I'll be satisfied. Of course that never happens. After I smoke, I'll be satisfied for like 2 microseconds. And then what happens? I want to smoke again. And again and again. And I'll smoke more and more. And before it was 5, in the beginning it was 5 cigarettes a day. Then it becomes 10. Then it becomes 20. Right? So that's the cycle of vrittis and samskaras, which also explains the psychology of addiction. And I think Brian does a nice job of explaining that. Okay, so now we get to the happier picture, how we get out of this mess. Aklishta vrittis are sattvic, so the good guna, the spiritual guna. And so these are the aklishta vrittis, these are sattvic. And they have the opposite effect. They are born of insight and culminate in liberation. When under the influence of the detrimental vrittis, so that's these vrittis, the klishta vrittis, the mind becomes attracted or repelled by sense objects drawing its attention. In its attempt to attain that which attracts it and avoid that which repels it, the mind provokes action, karma, which initiates a vicious reactive cycle. And it goes on again and again. Vrittis samskaras, vrittis samskaras. Okay. Okay, so so it's the sattvika buddhi, which is capable of what? Of discriminating between Purusha and Prakriti, separating out the Purusha in its true nature from the mental modifications. When it does that, what happens? It produces aklishta vrittis. Aklishta vrittis are those vrittis, those changing states of mind, which are actually conducive to making spiritual progress and ultimately leads to liberation. So ultimately, viveka khyati is an example that Hariharananda Āraṇya gives, which is the spiritual discrimination between Purusha and Prakriti. That's also, it's still a vritti, but it's a good vritti. It's one that helps you on the spiritual path and brings you closer to the goal of kaivalya, liberation. What happens when these aklishta vrittis are generated? It ultimately results in, paradoxically, chitta vritti nirodha. The ultimate goal has to be the elimination of all vrittis, including the aklishta vrittis. All vrittis have to go, including the ones that are conducive to liberation. So this reminds me of Sri Ramakrishna's story of the 3 robbers, when he's talking about the 3 gunas. Most of you know this. There's a wealthy gentleman walking along the street, and 3 robbers pounce on him, take away his money, and then the robber corresponding to tamas says, now we've taken his money, let's kill him. Second robber says, whoa, we don't need to go that far, rajas. So this second robber says, let's tie him to a tree so he can't run off to the cops, but we don't need to kill him. Ties him up. Rajas binds, tamas kills. That's the lesson so far. But then they go their merry way, having bound this poor guy to a tree. The third robber, representing sattva, furtively comes back to this poor gentleman, says, I'm so sorry about this, let me untie you. And he gently unties him, gently pulls him up, and says, come with me. You need to go in this direction to get where you're going. And this gentleman says, you've been so helpful to me. Why don't you come along with me? We'll have a nice time together. I'm just embellishing. And sattva says, where you're going, I cannot follow. So sattva can bring you all the way up to the point where it can point you in the direction of, now this is where you need to go, but I can't go with you. Exactly like that. These aklishta vrittis are our friends. But ultimately they say goodbye, and we have to, we have to kill them in a certain sense. It gets a little gruesome. Because chitta vritti nirodha, sorry guys, but I have to kill you too. So chitta vritti nirodha, ultimately resulting in liberation. Okay? I think that's enough. Okay, so now, do we have a couple minutes and do we have online questions? We probably do. Okay, so go ahead. I'll take some online questions.
Is consciousness determined when the entity is able to observe itself?
Is consciousness what?
Is consciousness determined when the entity is able to observe itself?
I think determined may not be the right word, but is an entity conscious if it's able to observe itself? That's how I'm taking the question, maybe. It depends on what you mean by observing yourself, observing itself. Can an AI robot observe itself? In a mirror, surely, but it can still just be an unconscious, insentient AI robot. If the question is, can it consciously observe itself? Can it be self-conscious? Like, the question is, if something is self-conscious, is it conscious? Of course it is. But I don't think AI robots are going to be capable of self-consciousness in a real sense. That's my hunch. That's the Vedantic / Indian spiritual hunch in general. Yeah. Other questions? Or anyone here that wants to follow up on that?
I was just saying that it's more like an extension of self-consciousness is actually an extension of self-reflection. So yeah, it would have to be
yeah, but it all depends. I mean, there's always going to be an AI version of all these things, like self-reflection. Yeah, ChatGPT can self-reflect, but does it make it conscious? I think not, right? I mean, AI robot, ChatGPT can make mistakes. It can get things right. There are all sorts of. It can make fun. It can make jokes, and yet not be conscious, right? All at the same time. Yeah. Any other online questions?
Is the causal body the one that gets liberated?
Okay, causal body is a term in Vedanta, and it's not, as far as I'm aware, it doesn't even exist in Sankhya Yoga philosophy. So yeah, it's good that we're trying to save Sankhya Yoga in some way. I think the best way to save it is to posit a jiva. But again, you're not really saving it. You actually have to modify the underlying metaphysics of Sankhya Yoga, because it doesn't, the metaphysics doesn't seem to accommodate, doesn't leave any room for a jiva. But yeah, this is another, you can posit a causal body or whatever, but the fact remains, there is no causal body in, that's at least conscious in Sankhya Yoga metaphysics, and there's no jiva. It doesn't seem to be any room for a jiva. Yeah.
Can the Viyoga through yoga be termed as Viveka of Advaita? And should this realization ultimately lead to Advaitic realization?
Wow, okay. We're bringing all sorts of paradigms here. First of all, yoga and Viyoga, I think the person is referring to a verse from the Bhagavad Gita, Dukkha Viyoga. So it's like yoga is the separation of oneself from all sorrow. And then this person is also bringing Advaita Vedanta. So I think let's try to be a little disciplined in sticking to a particular philosophical framework. I think that's important. So the framework we're working with here, because our text is the Yoga Sutras, is the philosophy of Sankhya and Yoga. Okay? So this is just a tip for people watching online. Try to keep the questions also focused on the text at hand, and let's try to stay within the metaphysical framework of Yoga and Sankhya. It'll make the class a little bit more fruitful. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You say there's no connection in Samkhya. What is known as Samyoga is the union of Prakriti and Purusha. Mm-hmm. It is on the Tattva chart between Purusha and Mula Prakriti. Mm-hmm. I was taught Pada 1 is for those already in Samadhi, and Sadhana Pada is for those who are not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. First of all, I mean, these traditional commentators didn't make charts. Charts are modern creations by scholars, and so I'd have to know what chart you're referring to and who created the chart. If they do have a term like Sanyoga, conjunction, and they really mean it, then I think that the chart is wrong in that way, because there can't really be in reality any conjunction between Purusha and Prakriti. So yeah, maybe if you can mention who the person is who's made the chart, we can talk about that. But at the same time, even some traditional Sankhya commentators and yoga commentators do use words like Sanyoga, conjunction, but they'll always qualify by saying apparent conjunction. We suffer because we think that we're bound up with nature when in fact we're not. But who's the we? Can't be jiva, because there's no jiva in Sankhya and yoga philosophy. So sometimes the language of conjunction is used, but it's always qualified, and it's never a real conjunction. Okay? All right. Any other questions? Anyone from the in-person who wants to say anything? No? We're good? Okay. So I'm going to repeat one more time. Our assignment for the next class is to study Sutras 1.6 to 1.8. And it's Bryant's commentary on the sutras are pages 32 to 39, and our next class will be held on Thursday, June 6th Is there one last question?
There's a movie recommendation
Ooh,
that
what's
has
that?
a new movie dealing with AI, and it's called The Creator.
The Creator.
Yeah, The
Interesting.
Creator.
Okay. So The Creator. I haven't seen it, so I can't vouch for it, but somebody online is recommending this film about the promises and perils of AI. Okay. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.